and traditional media. Learn how to combine direct mail, email, web, and other media to increase marketing ROI and effectiveness. So, today, with our fourth and final webinar in our series, we will hopefully help you understand how to effectively produce high impact direct mail and cross media marketing campaigns to maximize efficiencies, speed deployment, and avoid common traps, pitfalls, and blunders. So, before we start, let's take a moment to take care of some little housekeeping. Please take note that all attendees are muted. You can only hear me, the moderator, and Mark, the presenter. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me, so if you can, please raise your hand by pressing the hand icon on the left side of your GoToWebinar button panel. Janice, Frank, I see Jennifer, Julie, Julia, thank you so much. So I'm assuming Leanne, okay, great. I'm assuming that everybody else can hear me. Thank you, Laura, Maggie, great. For best audio results, I recommend that you use a headphone attached to your computer as we are transmitting via the internet. And for those who are interested, I will be sending out copies of the webinars and presentations by the end of this week. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the webinar where you can type your question in the questions section of your GoToWebinar panel, or alternatively, you can ask your question or make a comment on Twitter using hashtag DMProduction. Before we begin, I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who have made this series of educational webinars on direct marketing and direct mail possible. We have 4 sponsors to thank. A big thank you to XMPI, Xerox, the Low Martin Group, and of course, us at Canada Post. So without further ado, let's get started with today's webinar. Today's presenter and program ambassador for this webinar series is Mark Morin. Mark is a passionate marketing communications strategist with 30 plus years of hands-on experience in creating powerful, effective, and results-oriented material for national and international brands. He's also one of Canada's pioneers in relationship marketing education. Mark is president of Stratégie Marketing Direct, a relationship marketing agency focused on creating powerful, relevant B2B marketing campaigns. Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm fine, Rodrigo. How are you?
Thank you. Very well.
Excellent. So let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about direct mail and cross-media production. This is a presentation that's designed as an entry-level overview for those of you who may not be familiar with direct mail production. It's also a refresher for those of you who've been in the business for a few years and may not have gotten into some of the formats we're going to talk about today, or need to just refresh their understanding and their knowledge. So it's going to be an interesting one. Direct mail production, of course, is one of my personal passions, and I'm sure you're going to that'll show through as we go through the presentation today. Just there's nothing quite like the smell of ink on paper and being at a production facility and seeing how these things happen, and also making the paper do its magic. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk about a few different things related to production. We're going to talk about the cost structure of a direct mail package, so we understand what the leverage points are. We're going to talk about different formats and how we can optimize the results that we can get with our budget using imposition, for example, for certain specific formats that give us a lot of perhaps competitive advantage. We're going to look at some of the key elements of DM production and how we can work within that framework to be able to optimize and get the most out of our value, most value out of our production chain. So it should be an interesting 45 minutes, and so off we go. So the first and perhaps one of the most important things that we need to understand from a production perspective in DM and cross-media is to understand the importance of achieving a balance between the cost of what we want to do and the response that it's going to produce. So this balance is critical to being able to achieve the best, the most optimal return on investment. If we focus solely on driving out costs of the production of our piece, we may in fact be sacrificing response on the other hand. So it's important to make sure that anytime we invest in something, that it will in fact have an impact on the overall response rate, driving up the number of individuals who respond to our campaign. Or if we're driving out costs, that we don't sacrifice the the results that we're going to produce, or we could be producing if we had made that investment. So it's important to understand the cost structures and where the costs lie and how we can optimize all of that. So we're going to spend a few minutes looking at some typical campaign cost structures. Of course, these are just examples, and you'll find that depending on your situation, the cost structure will be a little bit different depending on what you're working with. So here's the first example. This is for an acquisition campaign. It's roughly 100,000 pieces, and the cost in the mail is roughly $1.25, to give you an idea. Typically, the response rate for this particular scenario is about 2%. So if we look at the breakdown of the costs, isolating postage and the laser data imaging costs, the creative and management of the program, development of a new concept, working with the creative teams, the production teams, with the client and so on, generates a certain amount of cost. This is an acquisition campaign, so there's also a cost component for list rental. So you may be renting some lists that will cost you anywhere from, let's say, $150 a thousand to perhaps up to $225 a thousand, depending on the selects that you would use, the filters that you would use to increase the relevance of your communication and make your campaign more effective and more impactful. And then you see the cost of print production itself, the actual pieces that you're using. So the envelopes and the letters, the brochure, the lift notes, the buck slips and so on that you would include in your package to be able to communicate the message effectively. In this particular case, the print production only represents about 21% of the overall cost of that piece in the mail. So when you add cost to the print side of things, for example, to add maybe a die cut, maybe an involvement device, perhaps you would want to create a more elaborate brochure with an intricate fold or something of that nature that would increase your production cost. It's important to understand what increase in response you would need to offset the increase in the cost of the printing. And when you put it in perspective, looking at the overall cost structure of your package, you realize that it is quite small indeed in this particular scenario. Now, if you're working with a large volume control package, a number 10 that you've been doing for years and years and constantly testing against and trying to beat, obviously, then the picture here, the portrait will be quite different because your creative and development and management costs will be relatively small. So the print production will be significantly more present in that cost structure. But in this particular scenario, a 50% increase in the cost of printing only requires a 10.5% increase in response to offset that cost. So it's a relatively small overall impact to be able to go to a more elaborate format, adding in something that would presumably increase the impact and the response rate of your campaign. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're analyzing potential enhancements to your package, to always understand what the specific cost structure for that package is. If you look at the same scenario with a campaign to house lists where you don't have the list rental cost, then production becomes a more significant component. If you eliminate the creative and management, of course, but there's always some form of cost associated with managing the production, your print production will still represent a fairly substantial portion of that. And yet it's not a linear relationship. There's always only a portion of that additional cost that needs to be offset. So here, in the case of a campaign where print production represents 25% of the overall cost, a 50% increase, and that's a quite significant increase overall, would only require a 12.5% increase in response to compensate for the additional cost. So if you're investing in things that you feel would be able to deliver a higher response rate, therefore more customers, then it's worth exploring if you're able to compensate with an increase in response. So understanding that, we have to make sure that we always invest in the things that have the probability or the likelihood of increasing our response rate, and managing the costs that add absolutely no impact to what we're doing. Some things are very cute and very creative, but don't contribute overall to the impact of the campaign, and so those are less important. We would not want to invest heavily in those types of devices, but more so on things that will in fact have an impact on the increased response rate. So what are some of the things that do, in fact, trigger an increase in response that will produce greater results overall? At least typically, in most scenarios, these are some of the things that you want to look at. So first and foremost, formats. And in most industries, an increase in the format size or a more original format, something that stands out in the mail, will produce better results. And if you've been following this series and the executive forums we've been doing, you've seen some of the research by the DMA that demonstrates the impact of going from a postcard to a letter size to an oversized format, and the lift in response is quite significant from one category to the next. So always look to formats first and foremost as a way of improving your impact and generating a greater response rate. Of course, targeting is going to be one of the most significant, if not the most significant contributing factor, but since targeting is less frequently a production-focused activity, we're not going to spend too much time on that today. Relevance, super important in creating a message that speaks to the consumer and talks to them with benefits and information that's relevant. This is more for the creative people to elaborate on, so we're not going to spend any time on that today. Involvement, however, the involvement devices, the gadgets, the tokens, the stamps, the scratch and wins, and all of those things that can add interaction to our piece, those are some of the things that you as production people, if you are in fact in production, would want to take forward to your creative team and make suggestions on how they can create more interaction, more intricate folds, perforated tabs that you remove, and all of those things that make the consumer spend more time with your piece, making it a more interesting, more intriguing, and perhaps more of a game, right, that moves people through the reading process so that it gets them more engaged and eventually, ultimately, translates into a higher response rate. And then, of course, cross-media integration, integrating the package with all the other tools that are at our disposal, whether it's email or web or social media, to be able to amplify the impact of our direct mail. So we're going to talk about a few of these formats, a few of these items over the next few minutes. So first of all, formats. We have to understand that there is a hierarchy in the impact of different formats on the response rates. So the basic level, of course, is the postcard. And there's not a lot to say about a postcard. It is what it is. When talking to your existing customers, when communicating with them, we know from the research that it produces a much lower response rate than a letter package, something that's more elaborate, that's more personal in terms of communication. Next level, self-mailers. Then number 10, envelopes, other envelope formats, and then on to dimensionals and creative formats that allow us a lot more freedom to be able to express our creativity in unique and unusual ways. So let's talk a bit about self-mailers for a moment. And this is a format that I particularly like. It's a trifold self-mailer that I've used extensively over the years. And from a production perspective, it's quite interesting because particularly if you're doing short-run digital, which is often the case when we do fulfillment campaigns, when we launch highly targeted activities to specific customers, it allows you to optimize the use of the sheet. If you're using, for example, four-color digital printing, or potentially on an iGen press, for example, then it allows you to optimize the sheet. So let me show you the imposition diagram. You can produce two up on a 14 by 20 size sheet, roughly 14 by 20. This is the optimum size of the basic iGen digital press. And with a double trim in the middle, it allows you to have two printed in one pass with all the address information already integrated into it, so that it's a one-step production process. And actually, it's interesting, there's a new upgrade to the iGen that allows you a 26-inch sheet. So that would mean you could actually create a package with, or a piece, a self-mailer with 4 panels. Even more interesting. So you could do gatefolds, and you can have a Z format that's quite interesting as well. So there are some additional possibilities by adding that additional panel in there. So something to keep in mind. The efficiencies with which you can produce multiple iterations of the same piece on a press sheet obviously give you the ability to maximize the productivity, because the click charge is going to be one of the most significant costs in producing your direct mail piece. Now, you would also want to look to some more creative formats. For example, this is a self-mailer that is sort of a cross-shaped self-mailer that folds down to itself and is sealed with a tab. The challenge here, of course, is that the assembly of all of this, the folding of the different panels as they cross over each other, and the insertion of the cards in the middle is essentially a manual process. So it's very high impact. It's very beautiful in terms of creativity, but it also requires a lot of manual labor. So that's going to add cost to the piece. Does the creativity of the piece itself compensate for the cost of the manual work that needs to be done, the hand assembly? Depends on your industry. In this particular case, this piece worked extremely well, and it's produced on a single, again, digital format sheet, so 1420, with a die cut. The pieces that are left in all the corners are then used as inserts placed in the center, and the imaging on the reverse side creates the address information. So it's one pass plus the die cutting and then the manual folding. Question is, of course, can you recover the additional cost with an enhanced response rate? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So you need to be able to test these formats to see just how well they produce, how they perform. Now, your typical number 10, you can have different sizes of letters. This particular one is a 14-inch with an attached reply device. And again, very simple to produce, optimizing on a 14 by 17 sheet, which is the maximum size of your typical laser printer. So instead of working with 1117 or working with smaller sheets, you can then impose 2 up and potentially even gutter trim so that the response device will fall out of the letter as it's opened, creating some form of interaction, forcing the consumer to pick it up and look at it, hold it in his hands, and see what the message is. So again, the ability to maximize the use of the press sheet in the imaging process allows us to reduce the cost of manufacture, expedite production, and make things all more efficient that way. Now, square format, very intriguing format. It has a very elegant look and feel to it. I've seen it used quite frequently these days. It certainly has a lot of impact graphically because it stands out compared to the number 10s that will be delivered at the same time. And this particular piece has a short letter, only 5.5 inches wide, folded in half, plus a reply device that is produced at the same time on the same sheet and then it's trimmed and detached before insertion. And the imposition looks like this. So you're actually getting 3 iterations of the same piece, 3 up, on a single sheet. Very efficient in driving out the imaging costs and making sure that you're optimizing the use of all of that process of producing. You can even, in this particular case, even go to a full digital printing to be able to reduce the number of steps involved. So produce the letterhead as well as the letter copy and the reply device all in one pass. And extremely efficient and quite intriguing as well. Now, of course, 6x9 is also an interesting format, and we know that the oversize, anything larger than a number 10, tends to produce a better result. 6x9 is interesting because the only really incremental cost is to move to the larger size envelope. The same letter size, the same reply envelope size, the same brochure will all fit into the 6x9 envelope typically. So you can use the same, if you're doing a test, you can use the same material as you would in your number 10 package, just change the fold, insert it into the 6x9, obviously repositioning the address block. And you can arrive at something that's quite intriguing in terms of lift, simply by modifying the outer envelope size. So there are a few tips. Now, one last thing that to keep in mind with the new standards that are now available for AdMail, you can do a full die cut with no straight edge. You simply have, this particular postcard was sent out to advertising agencies and marketing agencies recently. You can see that this piece is simply die cut out of cardstock. It's very impactful, certainly stands out with the rest of the mail. So now you can explore all kinds of possibilities for making your message more intriguing, more impactful graphically. So something to keep in mind. Now, involvement devices, really important. The more time your customers spend going through the piece, interacting with it, turning it into a game makes it more, well, the word says it, involving, right? So anything that you can do to create that interaction, that involvement, whether it's a token, a stamp, something that needs to be perforated and moved to a different location, anything that helps to force the consumer to spend more time reading and playing around with your message, the greater the likelihood that they will respond to it. So things like scratches, scratch-offs are highly effective, very intriguing. Everyone loves to do this, and it allows you to reveal a message that might be something that you win, but it might also be the percentage of savings that's part of your offer and so on. So very interesting, and it doesn't add a lot of cost to your package. Things like perforated tabs, I've shown this example a number of times. I still think it's a really brilliant piece of execution, because by removing that tab, you dramatize the benefit of the product that you're promoting. So simple things like that, the involvement of removing a perforated tab in itself is a sensorial experience. So people enjoy doing that kind of stuff, and it just creates a more impactful message. Different creative formats, pop-ups, things that drawers that open and dynamic folds and things that are very interactive can add impact to your message. They can make it more involving. It would encourage a consumer to spend more time looking at it. It stands out in the mail, so it all has an influence. These things have a cost attached to them, of course, and so you need to be testing them against a control package to see if they do in fact pull better. But there is the potential of increasing the impact of your message and the response rate overall by producing a more creative format. So we need to explore these things and try different possibilities and see how they influence our response rates. Now, so that's it for. Let's talk about one of the most significant costs, and rightly so. Let's talk about optimizing postage. How can you make sure that you're getting the best possible value for your postage dollar? So you have to understand that there are different categories of postage, and these different categories and the type of postage that you will use will have an impact both on the cost and also potentially on the response rate. So the ultimate form of postage, of course, is the letter mail stamp. Very authentic. When we create a direct mail package, what we're trying to do is to create a personal communication between the brand and the consumer, the customer. So the more authentic that communication is, the more real it looks, the greater the impact, at least in theory, and in most cases. So using a stamp will provide you with perhaps a higher open rate, and that should translate into a higher response rate. Now, of course, there is a cost attached to that, and so you have to weigh the difference between using a letter mail format with a full postage stamp or going with something that is in the ad mail category, addressed ad mail, that will be perhaps slightly less authentic but more affordable. So there are different categories, and of course the basic ad mail indicia that you see on the left-hand side is something that we recognize immediately. We've recently at Canada Post added the custom indicia, which gives you the visual appeal of a stamp, and it looks very much like a stamp, but obviously without the cost associated with it. So you're still in addressed ad mail, taking advantage of all of the cost savings that are afforded to you in that category, and yet you have more of a visually appealing postage where you could in fact make it look like a real stamp, or put your logo in there, or put your product or your spokesperson or whatever. So some intriguing ways of playing around with the type of postage. In business to business, for example, the postage meter indicia will make the piece of communication look a lot more authentic, more like business communication. So you want to gravitate more towards that, and so on and so forth. And even in postage, you now have the possibility of creating picture postage stamps where you can integrate your own logo or a message from your campaign or whatever, and they're quite beautiful. So understanding that, we also have to understand what are the key factors that will influence both the category of postage and the cost in the mail of our different things. So first of all, the nature of the message will influence whether or not we can qualify for ad mail. And of course, it does need to be of promotional nature, so you need to understand that if there's an offer in your communication, that will help it qualify. There's a whole series of criteria that you can find on the Canada Post website if you're not familiar with what qualifies as ad mail. And in that category, you then are able to optimize your postage cost based on the dimensions of your piece, the weight of the piece itself. So if you are within under 50 grams, for example, for a Drastad mail, you're going to be optimizing your postage. Density really plays the greatest role overall in reducing the cost, as well as machinability, of course. But the more pieces are concentrated in a given geographic area, the lower the overall postage rate when it's organized in a letter carrier sequence. So understanding these levers, you can then be more precise in your targeting. When you're renting lists, you may filter based on geography so that you're maximizing your density within a given area so that you're optimizing the cost of the postage for your campaign. So understand these levers, make sure that you understand the standards that are available, that are provided in these different categories, understand the weight of your piece, make sure that you're under the weight limits, and so that you're maximizing the use of that postage in an effective way. Now, let's talk about the various elements of the production itself and how we can ensure the maximum quality of whatever we do. So there are 5 basic elements. First of all, lists and data, very important. Since we are creating personal communication, it's very important that our data be accurate and clean and properly formatted, and that we don't want to be sending out multiple mailings to the same individual. So that would kind of destroy the idea that it's personal communication. Of course, there's printing, and one of the most significant parts of the printing aspect would be the envelopes themselves, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Of course, imaging that includes the personalization of your communication, the addressed information that allows you to get your piece delivered, the finishing, whether it's folding and inserting and so on, the different formats that you can use, the insertion into the envelope, and of course the induction process into the mail stream. So let's talk briefly about data and lists and how we need to control the quality of whatever we do to ensure that our communication is both deliverable and also that it is credible and properly addressed. There's nothing worse than a spelling a mistake in your name. It just kind of destroys the whole ambiance of the communication. So it's important to take a lot of care to make sure that you're managing your data and list quality very importantly. Well, the first thing that we all know about, or we should know about, is merge purge, and how that process of deduplicating a list will impact our ability to only communicate with the individuals once. And there are different levels of merge purge. Of course, you can decide that you want 1 per individual, or it could be 1 per household, or it may be, in fact, 1 per business. So depending on whether you're communicating to consumers or to corporations, you'll choose a different type of merge purge and a different level of precision in the elimination process. So you may want to narrow down and make sure that there's only 1 piece that goes to each household, or you may find it perfectly acceptable that both the husband and wife receive a piece that may, in fact, be totally different because you're personalizing it. So it's important to understand how that happens, what are the criteria that go into creating the merge purge, make sure that you specify the priorities of your different lists within the merge purge process so that you are, in fact, maintaining your customers as customers if they are duplicated against your rented lists and so on. So that's a very critical aspect, making sure that you're optimizing your production costs, eliminating all of the potential waste. Now, some nice to have things would be case conversion, making sure that you are using the appropriate conversion of upper lowercase to lowercase and so on, making sure that the message appears as aesthetically as possible. So a lot of work goes into making sure that all of that, the type is beautifully done, all the personalization is accurate and displayed appropriately. Change of address is something that we often forget to do. And we know that there are a lot of individuals that move with some frequency annually or even more so. And so making sure that our lists are up to date, using the change of address file allows us to identify duplicates that would be at different addresses that are in fact the same individual. It also makes sure that all of our mail gets delivered. And so we're avoiding a lot of the waste. The cost to optimize the addresses is relatively insignificant overall, so it's a good investment to make sure that we're not wasting pieces that won't get to the final destination. and that's really important. Address accuracy, of course, is part of um, the validation process to make sure that your mail is eligible for the letter carrier pre-sort and so on. So it's really important that you go through that process to make sure that you're not paying more than necessary. You want to make sure that you're able to reach that 95% accuracy that's required to be able to qualify for the best possible rates. So invest in some good address correction, make sure that it is all done appropriately. Then you may do some appending, merging several databases together, adding information to it, converting different file formats to make sure that they are all compatible so that all the data goes in the right places. And then last but not least, you choose the appropriate type of postal sortation, typically letter carrier pre-sort or machinable, even better because it affords you an even better rate. So very important to understand these different areas of control in the data and list area so that you're optimizing your production. Super important. Now, addressing and imaging. So making sure that the address is in the right place, that it's formatted correctly, that you imprint it appropriately on your piece. A couple of really important things, and they may seem basic, but at the same time, this is often where things fall apart in the production process, because the equipment that's used for addressing, for printing the letters and the address blocks onto the letters and so on, typically laser printers tend to be very high speed and slightly finicky in terms of the kind of paper that they'll accommodate. So, for example, grain orientation is super important. The sheet has to feed appropriately through the press. It has to not be curved in the wrong direction so that it doesn't block. All of this is mechanical and it happens at very great speeds. So it's important to understand what the grain orientation needs to be in order to produce effectively. So working with your print provider, with your marketing service provider, with your value-added mailer to understand before you go to press with the letter, for example, make sure that you have the grain oriented in the right direction and that the sheet is as flat as possible. So very important, otherwise it will block, it'll break down, you'll lose copies that will need to be reprinted, it gets very messy, and at some point you may in fact have a job. Now another thing that we tend to forget is we have to make sure that anything that's printed offset is with heat compatible ink, because if it's not, then as it goes through the laser printer, it will transfer. Again, you'll have a repeated pattern of your logo or your letterhead that will be imprinted onto the letter. It gets very messy again. So you have to make sure that when you specify your job for printing, that you specify heat compatible inks. Of course, you don't want to have any form of UV varnish or water base or dryers used for your sheet, because it will prevent the laser from sticking onto the paper. So again, you end up with a very messy effect where you can hardly read the text, and so you have to reprint again. And reprinting isn't the big problem as much as it is the time that you'll lose in the process of redoing the job and starting over again. So very, very important. Stock selection is, again, another very critical thing. We all love to have coated stock because it looks so much nicer. It carries the ink much better, so it has a lot more impact. However, the problem is the laser toner doesn't stick very well to certain surfaces, certain coatings, so you would want to privilege dull or matte stock that is, in fact, more readable. Right? It has less reflection on it, so the eye can read the text more accurately and with less effort. Or uncoated stock itself. So those would be the good choices. Gloss is perhaps more glitzy, more beautiful, but tends not to stick. So that can be a problem. And then we always have to keep in mind that humidity is another factor that goes into that process. So drying time, 24 to 48 hours, depending on the type of stock, to make sure that everything is dry, that there won't be any offsetting, that you won't have any problems feeding the job through the press. Very important to plan for that time. And the challenge is, of course, that with all the delays and challenges that come up along the way, when you get to the production stage, when you get to the laser and letter shop stage, there's very little time left. All the buffers are gone. So these waiting times, drying times, and so on tend to eat up whatever time is left, and sometimes it's just not there. So we try and push things and go too fast and end up with problems in production. And then you have to start over again, right? Reprinting, and it gets all very, very messy very fast. So keep in mind that you need those dry times. You need to be able to plan this stuff out and make sure that you have sufficient buffers in the production schedule to accommodate all of these possibilities. Now, sometimes when speed is really critical, when time to market is the most important consideration, you have to start thinking about going to full color digital. So instead of doing the offset and then lasering on top, you go straight through to a digital sheet that includes both the imagery and the text and the addressing information, so that you have one single pass, one single step. It is more costly, typically, although on small short runs, the cost will be quite equivalent, around 2 or 3, up to 5,000 pieces. There'll be no significant cost difference between one and the other. But it does allow you to be in the market more quickly, so you may save 2, 3, 4, 5 days, and 5 days may be critical to getting your offer in the marketplace very quickly, perhaps compensating for some delays that happened early on in the creative process or in the artwork development or whatever. So sometimes you need to consider this. We've used digital printing for long run, for very elaborate documents in 100,000 copies, simply because the importance of being in the marketplace quickly was much greater than the cost associated with going to the digital. Saving those 3, 4, 5 days meant the opportunity of recovering some of the sales that would be lost if we hadn't been in the marketplace sooner. So sometimes it's worth spending a bit more to make sure that the job gets into the mail stream more quickly. And digital also gives you the possibility of combining runs of multiple campaigns combined together, as long as they have the same format. So you would simply optimize your letter carrier route by combining multiple campaigns in a single pass. And so that allows you to optimize a number of different things and compensates for the additional costs of going to full color digital. Now, finishing. A lot of things that can be done on the folding side, creating all of these intricate folds and creating pieces that are more exciting, more interactive. And so, you know, there's all of the standard things that we need to take into account, the basic folding of the brochures, but also if we want to detach the response device, so the slitting and gutter trimming is something that you may want to consider. There are two schools of thought around that. One says that the response device should fall out of the fold of the letter so that the consumer is encouraged to grab hold of it and look at it, examine the content, and see what is asked of them. The other school of thought thinks that it should be attached to the letter, because when the consumer is finished reading, then they can actually see the response device immediately there and act on it. Of course, a lot of what we do today is also drive to web, so perhaps the response device is less useful in that sense. However, keep in mind that the reply device itself communicates the message that response is expected of the consumer. And so they implicitly and intuitively know that we're asking them to place an order or to buy. So that creates a mental trigger, as well as providing a means of responding. So keep that in mind, and perhaps test the two and see if there is a significant difference between one and the other in your particular environment. There are all kinds of different steps that involve affixing and tipping on different things, whether it's a sample, a gift card, some kind of device that you want to use as an involvement device to get people to play around with your piece. Keep in mind, of course, that those types of things, those finishing steps, will add or may add substantially to the time required to produce your piece. And in many cases, particularly with tipping, the access to the equipment is in fact difficult to get. The machine time is not readily available. The schedules are booked long in advance. So, and you know how it is with production schedules, they tend to shift around, and so you may lose your window of opportunity. We've found that when tipping is involved, oftentimes it's preferable to use an envelope to insert the piece rather than tip it onto a card, because it is less costly and saves a lot of time. So the addition of the envelope increases the responsiveness of the piece, at the same time eliminates some of the costs associated with the finishing. So that's really neat. And of course, the insertion process itself is really important. I'm going to cover a few details in a moment about what you need to keep in mind to make sure that, and it sounds obvious, but it's far from that, making sure that all your pieces can be inserted, that all the elements fall in the right place. And always keep in mind when you're specifying for your value-added mailer, your letter shop, make sure that you give them an inserted sample so they know what order, what sequence, and what orientation to give to all the different components, so that when the consumer removes them from the envelope, that the message is delivered in the proper sequence, in the proper order. It may be more optimal for insertion to do it one way, but you also have to keep in mind that we're trying to deliver a message here. So the unfolding, the unveiling of that message, the sequence of that unveiling is of critical importance in many cases, at least substantial importance in others. And then, of course, there's the tabbing and sealing process. If you're using a self-mailer, in many cases, most cases, you'll need to affix a tab or a clip seal to seal the piece so that it doesn't open in the mail stream, but also to create some interaction with the consumer. Again, this adds cost. It also adds time to the process. So whenever you are in a very tight schedule, you have to understand that some of these additional processes will add time. What can you do to eliminate them, to minimize the implication and the impact on production? Now, I'd just like to draw your attention to this, speaking of folding, to this particular channel on YouTube from the Fold Factory, foldfactory.com, as a matter of fact. They have a whole series of clips on super cool folds, and so you can use this as a reference of ideas, a source of information, a source of possibilities of how you can create these intricate and unusual folds. Some of them are manual, some of them are automated, so all kinds of possibilities. It's a great source of inspiration. Sorry. Now, last but not least, the printing of the component, and specifically the envelopes. And it's really important to understand that there are multiple types of envelopes, crossback and double-side seams and square flaps and baronial, and it just goes on and on and on. And one of the biggest impacts of the format that you pick is the ability to insert and to mechanize the insertion process. So, for example, the announcement or long flap envelopes are more difficult to insert mechanically, so sometimes if you go to that kind of format, you'll need to have some manual insertion. That'll add cost, it'll add time. So when you decide to pick a given format of envelope, spend some time with your production specialist, with your value-added mailers, with your letter shop, to make sure that it is mechanizable so that you don't end up with some additional costs and some wasted time. Windows play a very important role in communicating the message that's inside the envelope, creating some intrigue, presenting or making use of the color of the piece that may be inside. For example, if you have an elaborate four-color brochure, then it will show through the window. And so adding color to a single one-color envelope on the outside. So great ways of playing around with creating visual intrigue, creating more impact. Using Windows are all kinds of possibilities, so explore those with your envelope provider. And of course, business reply, super important. If you're using business reply, keep in mind that there is a standard format for this. The artwork can be requested from Canada Post and provided very quickly. There are a certain number of elements. Of course, you have the indicia on the upper right-hand corner, but there's also a barcode that appears above the address, and that needs to be in the proper size and in the proper position. Note the postal code as well. You'll see that in most cases it'll come back with a change to the postal code ending in 9Z9, and I've had customers request that we change it back to their actual postal code, but this is the indication that this is in fact business reply postage, so it is correct and normal that you see the postal code changed to 9Z9. So very quickly. Now, last and not least, the most important thing is making sure that things fit. And when you design a direct mail package for the first time, you may neglect to do these things because we tend to design them as individual elements rather than thinking of them as a combination of things that need to fit together. So making sure that your letter fits in the envelope is super important. And depending on the equipment that you're using and the thickness of what you're putting into the envelope, you'll need anywhere from 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch on either side of the largest component that in order for it to fit into the envelope and insert mechanically at fairly high speed. So if you're too tight, then the piece will not insert properly. It'll jam, you'll have all kinds of stoppages on the production chain, and you'll end up having to reprint the pieces that are damaged, and it slows everything down, and that obviously adds cost. So making sure that you have sufficient width on either side, and of course also width at the bottom, so that when the piece is inserted mechanically, it will tend to bounce off the bottom and move up. And so if it goes up too high, if the piece is too large, then your flap won't fold over properly, and then it'll get all messed up and not produce the result that you're looking for, and typically, potentially, might not even seal properly. So you have to allow for these safety zones within the pieces that you're creating. So a minimum amount of fit is very important. And at the same time, you also have to take into account that too much fit is also a bad thing. So if you're doing a number 10 envelope, which is 4 1/8 by 9 1/2, and you're inserting an 8 1/2 by 11 letter that's folded down to 8 1/2 by 4 3/4, you'll typically have a 1/2 inch float on either side. So if your window is too small, there's the potential that you'll cut off some very important information, because the letter will move from left to right within the envelope. So if it's jogged totally to the right-hand side, you'll actually have an inch on the left-hand side. And so your address information will be moving completely to the left, cutting off the letter carrier pre-sort information. And when you do that, your piece is not deliverable. So you have to make sure that your window is sufficiently wide to accommodate the floating of the piece within the envelope. So sometimes you might go to a larger letter, you may have a larger window. Sometimes from a design perspective, you don't want to go to a larger window size because of visuals that you're having on the envelope. In that case, go to a smaller point size. You can't go to too small, but you can reduce it slightly to accommodate all of that. But many things that you need to keep in mind to make sure. When you're doing a business-to-business campaign, of course, you'll have additional lines of address information. So the title, the company name, perhaps the suite number might, in fact, be on that line as well. And so you need to provide for a larger, a taller window as well. So all of these things are, picky little details, but this is where typically things fall apart. When you get to the letter shop, you've created this beautiful campaign, and it just doesn't insert, or it doesn't fall in the right place, or the information isn't visible where it needs to be, and so you end up with a bit of a mess there. So very important to keep those things in mind. So we're almost out of time, and so we're at the end of the presentation. So in closing, basically keep in mind these things. First of all, always balance the cost of whatever you're doing versus the lift in response that it may provide, and understand how your cost structure is laid out for any given project. Understand what your leverage points are. Always invest where it counts. Make sure that you're investing in formats and relevance and targeting and involvement and in integration as well. Those are the leverage points that will provide you with a higher response rate, with a higher result. Understand the key steps of the production process and manage what counts, making sure that you're managing the timing and the process and the steps that you're using to create that piece, so that you are in time, in the mail, on time, and on budget. And always remember this, of course, you already knew that, the devil is in the details, and in direct mail, even more so. There are so many different stages that if you don't manage it appropriately, there are so many possibilities, the things that can go wrong. You have to be very detailed focused. You already are, of course, so just pay a little bit more attention and make sure that you understand where things can fall apart. And that's all I had for you for today. Rodrigo?
Yes, thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for a great presentation. Let's hit some Q&A questions. I have Troy that's asking, is it still an industry standard to mail French records as all uppercase to avoid misuse of accents?
Coming from Quebec, that is a question that I'm very sensitive to. Actually, there are some fairly reliable tools, data tools, that can convert and accentuate as well, using a table of first names to identify the probability that an individual might in fact be Francophone. And in that case, you use those tables to convert. There is a margin of error there, but it's probably negligible overall. I tend to prefer upper lowercase with accentuation. If you do lowercase without accents, that looks bad. And the uppercase is less elegant, right? It's more form letter. So maybe if you can get the conversion done at the accentuation, you're comfortable with a 1 or 2% accuracy rate on that, or inaccuracy rather, then I would go that route. Otherwise, yes, you're right. Upper lower certainly alleviates the accentuation problem in theory, although in Quebec we tend to accentuate uppercase. So you just can't win.
Perfect. I have another question on merge purge. How do you ensure that records that are ultimately duplicates but are spelled slightly different are caught? For example, if the person is John Smith in one record or Jonathan Smith in another record, both at the same company.
Yeah, very difficult. Of course, there are many ways of doing merge purge, and how you build the match code that allows you to identify the dupes certainly will have an incidence on that. So if you build it appropriately, you can compensate for the potential of typos. And you mentioned business to business as one of the criteria here. Obviously, when you do a B2B mailing, you kind of want to take a look at it, eyeball the potential dupes, the ones that are close enough. So I would pay a lot more attention to the output of the merge purge in a business to business mailing, because you want it to be letter perfect, of course.
I had a question on what is tipping?
Tipping is the affixing of an object, whether it's a card or a sample or whatever, with some release glue onto a backer card of some kind. So it might be a postcard or an insert card that would then receive for example, a gift card that's glued to it. And the release glue, of course, comes off as you remove the card itself. So that's what we typically refer to as tipping.
I have another question. Will there be will there be a similar discussion around unaddressed ad mail? I can answer that. I mean, this is the final part of the series with Mark, but we can certainly we will continue to do webinars in the future, and we can certainly look into that.
Sounds like a great topic, though. There's so many things to know and understand about the preparation process and the distribution process. There's a great opportunity there for a webinar.
Yes. Any other questions? We still have a few minutes. Well, that seems to be it, Mark.
Very good.
Well, Mark, thank you again for this great presentation, and thank you for sharing all of your insights throughout this 4-part series. It was great working with you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for all your attention and your patience.
Did you want to thank this one last time the sponsors?
Oh, my goodness. I almost forgot. My apologies.
No problem.
Before we sign off. Okay. So before we sign off, I again want to thank, and I can't thank them enough, the 4 sponsors involved in this series. First and foremost, Canada Post for championing this series, this educational series, and making it possible to reach out to the marketing community. So thank you very much for arranging this. Of course, our title sponsors, XMPie, the platform that allows for an incredible level of variability and relevance in communication. Xerox, that is the premier production platform for digital in Canada, and Low Martin Group, one of the major forces in marketing communication. So thank you all very much for your support. It would not have been possible without your help.
Well, perfect. Well, this concludes this Canada Post webinar and the 4-part series. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it useful and insightful. So on behalf of Mark and myself and Canada Post, we wish you a great day and talk to you soon.